Today is Friday, December 26th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, we are, in fact, fitting in one more podcast before the end of 2025.
That's right. Astute listeners who listened to the last podcast we posted would hear that you just said the same date. And that's because we continue to take advantage of individuals coming by and being here and to, as I think I mentioned last time, wring them dry of every drop they can give us. And so we have with us again Mr. Mark Sandor in the studio / Mr. Robinson's office. Mr. Sandor, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. Excited to talk about history.
That's exactly what we're going to talk about. We kind of, actually, I felt, last time he was here, we talked about questions and answers people have sent, but I did feel like we really ought to talk about some history if he's in town.
Yes. Tell us again about your background in history and, well, frankly, why you're such an expert.
Well, expert might be a bit a tall order, but I will say that when I was in college, I ended up with a bachelor's in history. That was part of going into education because I also got an education degree so that I could teach history in public schools, which I did for about a decade. And not history all the time. There was times that it was civics or economics, but taught ancient history, Arkansas history, and I feel like I'm forgetting something else over the time there. Oh, probably geography. So history adjacent. And then was also able to go back to school and start taking classes to work towards a master's, but never quite finished a master's degree in history. I believe I have 18 out of the 30 hours that are required for that. But beyond that, it's also just a lot of listening to podcasts, reading books, and since I enjoy it, it's fun to keep after.
I've been to Mr. Sandor's house more than a few times.
Mm-hmm.
He does, in fact, have history books, and he doesn't just have them on the bookshelf. He reads them. So
yeah, he is definitely a fan of history. It's I would say, just like I deeply enjoy mathematics, Mr. Sandor definitely enjoys history. And so today we thought, for the sake of the podcast, that he would talk about a little time there that it happens right there between two very important things in the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. You end with Malachi. Next thing you know, you're reading the book of Matthew. That time there is a time in history that's important to understand. So you want to learn to think biblically, you need to know the context. And so today we are going to talk about what's going on between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Boyer, and welcome back. And I have to say, one of the reasons I'm excited about today's podcast is I am not a history-oriented person. I just I have the things that I really enjoy, and history is not something I tend to dive into a lot, but I do enjoy hearing others talk about it. I enjoy hearing those who have invested in it, and not just our guest, Mr. Sandor, but Mr. Robinson. I've learned a lot from what you've said, Mr. Robinson, about the podcast you've listened to, and you've listened to some really good ones going into detail about various periods. And I know you yourself had some questions about the very period that we're going to be talking about today in terms of the New Testament starts, and all of a sudden there's all these characters on the stage, and where in the world do they come from?
Well, exactly. I remember, actually, I don't remember when, but it would have been in my 20s for sure, where one day I finally said, who are the Pharisees? There's like not really an introduction to the Pharisees. You get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're just there. And who are they and where they come from? Because you wouldn't get any clue about their presence from the way the Old Testament ended.
Yeah, you're right in the New Testament, and they're wielding power and influence of some sort. They're clearly important people. They're involved in the judgment against Jesus Christ eventually. The people are very deferential to them, and yet where do they come from? Who are these people? Let alone actually the Sadducees.
Yep.
The Sadducees do have a very obvious beginning, but if you're not really used to the word, and you think it's not like you saw the word Sadducee a whole lot in the Old Testament, right? And you do wonder where those came from in the time between the two testaments. That's my understanding. Leaning on you guys, it kind of helps to make all that clear.
Well, Mr. O'Gwen, as part of his Bible study series, has a Between the Testaments Bible study, and then also, I think we'll mention this later, Dan Carlin's King of Kings history podcast that he did that we're debating whether or not we can recommend.
We're always careful about recommending things outside of what we do, but and we've kind of said we can't say with certainty that he doesn't ever use any foul language or something, but at the same time, I think what caught most of our attention was just how serious and just bloody and terrible and explicit history is, and he does not spare those kind of details.
Well, what I loved about it was it other than just enjoying history in general, but listening to it, I didn't realize how much these King of Kings that he goes through and covers historically were a lot of them from the end of the Old Testament into the between the Testaments time period and even into the beginning of the New Testament. So these were very influential kings that made their mark on the area, on that whole area. And so there is some bringing in some secular history actually helps us a little bit here, in addition to what the Bible has presented for us. So I will hand over to our guest lecturer.
Yeah, we've teed you up, Mr. Sandor. Get us going.
If you feel like you're talking too much and you want to hand it off to us, I'll just say no. Just go on.
Yeah, we can make up random fake facts all day long. So
that'd be fine. No, we can. We'll see how we do here, because I do think it's very interesting when we think about the Bible. Sometimes it is almost easy to look at it as being a book that was written consecutively. That the first, you start with Genesis and Moses is writing that, and then when you get to John writing Revelation, you might think, well, okay, that must have all been in the same time period, when in fact the entirety of the Bible, what do we normally say, about 1,500 years from about the time of Moses to John, somewhere in that range. I'm already...
No, that sounds about right.
Okay, good. Certainly just with the authors, that if Moses, if we put him at 1500 BC.
Yeah,
roughly,
that's right.
And then, and then John, we keep him close to zero.
So 1500, 2000 years. Yeah, it's a long spread between.
And even within that, there's significant gaps. Mr. Robinson already brought up that when you close the Old Testament, you have nothing mentioned of Pharisees, Sadducees, or even Romans. I mean, like that, none of those things have been brought up, and it's not too surprising because there's at least 400, probably around 450 years between where the Old Testament concludes and the New Testament picks up. 450 years ago, that would get us back to from today. If we went back 450 years from today, and we went back to 1550. Mm-hmm. So you've barely discovered the North America from that point of view. I'm trying to think, would that be Henry VIII? I'm really behind because I know I'm before the presidents, right? We're well before any president was here. We're well before most of that thing. And so if you went back to that time and you were reading things from 1550, you would not hear anything about the United States, Democrats, Republicans, these things that we take for granted today that would show up in our writing today that again was very similar to the Old Testament, not addressing things that just had not quite happened yet. But the nice thing is the Bible does sort of give us at least a very brief outline, or one book in the Bible provides a bit of a bridge in terms of prophecies it's giving in the Old Testament, that we see those prophecies being fulfilled by the time you get to the New Testament. And most of those would actually be in the book of Daniel. And so in Daniel chapter 2, and I don't want to go through all of it. That's where I'm trying to make sure we don't spend all the time in Daniel 2, because it's just a great chapter.
Would be tempting, right?
Yes, and there's so much that's going on there. Nebuchadnezzar is having his dream. Many of you have probably even seen our visual representations, but this image that he sees of the head of gold, and then let me actually just start reading here a little bit, starting in verse 36, where Daniel is now interpreting the dream, where he says, "This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O King of Kings, you, O King, are a King of Kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. And kind of here's the key at the end of verse 38. You are the head of gold. You are this head of gold. So we actually have a very specific identification of the Babylonians being the head of gold.
And let me, for context, we haven't mentioned it for those who might be new. Dr. Meredith always tell me, make sure we know. The vision is of a statue. It's a giant statue, and in the vision, it's got the from the head to the toes, it's made of different materials. So when he talks about being the head of gold, he means literally in the vision at the top of the statue, there's a head of gold. And what you're saying is he was just telling Nebuchadnezzar, you are that head of gold.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and that's what he's. Again, I'm abbreviating here, so by all means, feel free to read all of Daniel 2. As I believe you all have mentioned before, we do recommend reading the Bible.
We do recommend reading the Bible.
So even though we're giving it an expert, please go through all of it. Continuing in Daniel 2, verse 39, Daniel continues by saying, "But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others." And then he goes into some other parts that we won't quite address today, but that you have these four major kingdoms that he is telling Nebuchadnezzar. That's what you were seeing in this statue, that the statue was a progression of four different kingdoms, starting with Babylon, moving into a silver kingdom, a bronze kingdom, and an iron kingdom. And so we actually see how that starts to play out in the scriptures today. What's sort of interesting about those four kingdoms is that while there is a lot of variety between those four different kingdoms, one thing is that they all ruled over the promised land. All of them were the political dominant force during their time over the promised land, even though beyond that they might have controlled vastly different territories.
You know, and one of the interesting things I learned about Nebuchadnezzar specifically is there was another sermon I was putting together that was really not directly related to Nebuchadnezzar, and his name kept popping up constantly in Jeremiah, where you'll find it the most. But I went and looked it up, and the word Nebuchadnezzar is used 91 times. His name is mentioned 91 times in the Bible, and God often will mention that he refers to him as his servant.
Yes.
So a lot of what Nebuchadnezzar was doing was being used by God to shape where things needed to be headed.
Right. And so dealing with this head of gold, we actually don't want to spend as much time on it simply because the Babylonian Empire actually ceases before you get out of the Old Testament. I do think we want to maybe give it a couple minutes here because it is that head of gold, and so understanding that is a little critical. Certainly Babylon, one of the years, and I love history, but I'm not a big one on saying that you have to go memorize a bunch of years. But if you can remember one year that really is instructive, it would be 586 BC. And unfortunately, a lot of times you would say probably 586. It could be 587, and there's some different ones. But around that time, most of the commentaries I saw have 586, because that's when Nebuchadnezzar does his third and final conquering of Jerusalem and deports and ends the independent nation of Judah. And it's also close. We don't know exactly when this dream happens, but it's close to this dream where I find it just very curious that God is shifting the civil political emphasis of the Bible from a focus on the tribes of Israel, where before 586 it's to focus on the building of the nation of Israel, the division of the nation of Israel, the collapse of Israel, then the collapse of Judah. And then in 586 we get this or very close to it, we get this dream from Nebuchadnezzar that lets you know, hey, from here on out, you're actually going to focus on Gentile kingdoms. You're going to focus on the head of gold for Babylon, and then you're going to go for other kingdoms after that, none of which are necessarily Israelite-based when we get to Babylon and certainly the other ones that come after it. Now, briefly, the Babylonians, we would say that they started around 626 BC to 539 BC. 539 is sort of a famous one in the Bible as well, since that is Daniel chapter 5, when you find that Babylon gets conquered by the Persians, sort of a famous scene there with the handwriting on the wall, and again, another interesting chapter to go through in time. If you're looking in Daniel, you find that Babylon is described as the head of gold. And also in chapter 7, there's the 4 different animals that are mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, and they're the first one. This is going to be where Daniel sees pictured as a lion that has wings like an eagle but tears them off, and anyway, some other interesting things there. But once again, is the first of the sequence. We won't go quite as much into the prophetic aspects of all of that today, but you can. We have many booklets, Mr. Smith. What booklet do you think might be jump to mind about covering?
Well,
some
the
of these?
booklet, the Revelation booklet, actually does talk to them in some degree as well, and we've even thrown around the idea.
I think the Middle Eastern prophecy also.
Oh,
has,
I bet you're right.
I
bet you're right.
good options.
We've even talked about possibly one day doing a Daniel booklet, to kind of go in far more detail. But from what you're saying, because I remember when I first learned about these things, that in many different visions, the same kingdoms are discussed.
Correct.
And that's kind of what you're highlighting here. And the different visions do give different details about some of the interactions, some of the events that impact that kingdom. And so what you're saying is here in this, not just the statue vision, but this vision of beasts, we also have a picture of not only Babylon, but other kingdoms as well.
Yes, and in that they're going to be coming after this. And especially since, sort of like we mentioned, Babylon ends here in the book of Daniel. There's even books in the Bible written during the next period, the Persian time period, and that's where we'll go next. Mr. Robinson, anything else about the Babylonians? Okay, yeah, we do want to...
Because we're not really technically between the testaments yet, right? Because like you were just saying, Babylon actually comes to an end, and it's still Old Testament time. It's still on the Old Testament clock. Okay.
Correct. And that's part of the reason we're starting with them, because Daniel does. It gives us a convenient place to start biblically, but we're also not going to give them a whole lot of extra time today.
I'm a bit rusty on this. Didn't the Babylonians also kind of replace the Assyrians, having been on the scene earlier?
To a degree, they certainly did from the Jewish perspective. The Assyrians were generally a far larger and had ruled as an empire for far longer than the Babylonians do. When Assyria falls, Babylon is going to be the one that takes over the lion's share of the Assyrian Empire, but it doesn't get all of it.
Yeah.
And so the Assyrian Empire kind of gets divvied up between the various nations that were defeating it. So, but certainly from the Jews' point of view, Babylon was the new ruler in town, and they got 60% of it, something. So certainly would be the closest to the replacement.
So Persia came next.
Persia comes next. They are the one that is going to be in charge when the Old Testament ends. And so we actually find that there's a lot of different places in the Bible you can read about the Persians. Again, just for some fun numbers and so on, 559 BC to 331 BC is where you would find Persia. So roughly 200 years. It would be just kind of a quick estimate for the Persian Empire. Lasts quite a while, though. I mean, that's a good run.
Yeah, it is.
They are going to take over a lot. But maybe before I get too far ahead as to what the Persians are doing, just a reminder that just like you find the Babylonians, not only here in Daniel, you'll find the Babylonians mentioned at the end of 2 Kings, the end of 2 Chronicles. You find them in various prophecies. The Persians show up in a fair number of books as well. In particular, books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all narratives set during the Persian time period of the Jews returning to the Promised Land, or Esther being eventually chosen as the queen of the Persian Empire. You have prophecies, obviously we're in Daniel, but Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, those last 3 of the 12 minor prophets, minor prophets, like we call them that, but they're short books, right?
We don't mean
That's all it
minor
means.
league. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, they're still good ones. And so, but if you read those 3 at the end of the Old Testament, Haggai, Zechariah, or Malachi, those are also during the Persian time period as well. And so there's plenty to read in the Bible that is related to the Persian times. And again, what we kind of see from Daniel is that we had mentioned in Daniel chapter 2, I'm not going to turn back there, but that's where you've now moved into the chest of silver. Daniel 7 has a very interesting comparison because it describes it here as a second beast, and this is Daniel 7 in verse 5. where Daniel says, "And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said to it thus, Arise, devour much flesh." And this is because the Persians are going to be far larger of an empire than any of the other ones that have come before it. They'll eventually get eclipsed by the Greeks and Romans who are coming up here, but they're far larger than the Babylonians, far larger than the Assyrians who had come before them. Those 3 different ribs have been identified somewhat differently from depending on who's doing the interpretation, but usually it's associated with Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. They had already conquered parts of Assyria when Assyria fell. Now, Lydia is a country that you may or may not have ever heard of before. Basically, it's Turkey. Turkey today was, at that point in history, called Lydia. Turkey had a number of different names throughout
I was about
history.
to say, I've heard the Anatolian Empire, the Hittites, and such associated with that.
Yep.
So a lot of labels, huh?
Yes.
A lot of labels.
Yeah, whoever happens to be in charge at that time. And the Lydians were briefly after the Assyrians fell, and then they get conquered by the by the Persians here. And so the Lydians are one of those 3 ribs in this bear's mouth. And so they rise to power. They are going to be, again, a huge empire, and they're the ones who are in charge when, if you ended the Old Testament or you got to the end of the Old Testament, that's it. You're in Persian time period. And again, there's a lot more information. This is where Mr. Robinson brought up that a podcast about the Persians called Kings of Kings by Dan Carlin goes through a lot of the history of that. And we'd even kind of debated about disclaimer guy, but sometimes maybe just a quick disclaimer about history in general is that, if you're going to look for information about the Persians, the Bible is going to give you some information, but it's not a focus on the Persians by any means.
Right.
They are mentioned because of their interactions with God's people, not because the Bible is going to try to give you a deep insight into the Persian Empire. But once you go to something like Dan Carlin, that's fine. You just keep your brain turned on,
Yep.
Right.
History's bloody.
It
Yes.
is.
Oh, yes.
Both of those things. Actually, we did a podcast with you, I think, on keeping your head on straight when you're studying history. So keeping your biblical thinking in place. That was an old podcast. Maybe we can find that. I don't think we're a single digit episode number by them, but it was a long time ago. But also, the Bible has some pretty gory scenes in it here and there, but I remember when we were putting together the Germany booklet, the Germany and Prophecy, I probably delved more into the history of Assyria than I ever really had. And I thought I could never even speak some of their atrocities aloud. I would not want other people to think of what they had done to other people. So you have to keep that in mind.
I think it's Dan Carlin that says, to describe the Assyrians, think of them like the Romans, but worse.
Yeah,
That's right.
That's
not
not
a bad description.
Absolutely terrible. And one thing that's fascinating about this, and I saw this noted in your notes, that this is one transition we actually get to see in Scripture from the Babylonians to the Persians. That handoff, if you will, as a major empire is actually described in the Bible in a real way.
Yes.
I might mention just historically, one of the things that podcast helped me, it gave me a much greater understanding of Persia, just how vast their territory and holdings were, and then also to give them credit for actually being incredibly well organized. And to some degree, they didn't mess with you too much as long as you didn't give them trouble. Yeah. And so I thought, man, imagine trying to govern an area as big as theirs was without email, instantaneous communication,
right.
High speed anything. And so they had to devise a system to rule over it, and they were really pretty clever about that. And I came away with a little more respect for the Persians because they don't get a lot of and they don't get a lot of positive press in some circles.
Sure. Well, and that's part of the benefit, I think, of listening to Dan Carlin, because even though he keeps his own religious views largely silent, he does not treat the Bible as a inspired document, but he does treat it as a historical document, and he uses it to compare and contrast with other histories about the Persians. And that's where I know sometimes I enjoy listening to a history where at least they'll reference the Bible, bring it out, and say, here's what we can learn about this historically. Because a lot of times, in the Living Church of God, and rightly so, we're focused on the theological lessons of what the Bible has to say. But for some historians, they might be looking through the more historical lens and finding things that for us are, again, rightly secondary, but still are kind of interesting to be able to have on the radar as well.
Right.
The other thing I learned was the only thing the Persians couldn't defeat was Greek heavy infantry.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's and wow, yeah. If we're at a risk of going really deep into the Persians. There's a lot of fun stuff with them there, and yeah, you have the tale about their two failed invasions of Greece. You have the 10,000 who get hired and have to escape out. There's a lot of fun stories about the Greek and Persian interactions, which again are all in between the Testaments.
Wow.
And a lot of things that by and large either the Bible's silent on or that are certainly not described in detail.
Nice.
Yeah. Anything else before we move on to the
Well, no,
Greeks?
is that it? Maybe that's a good time to kick off to the Greeks. So
Yeah.
they come next, right?
They do, and they are ones that we almost need to pause on a little bit more, simply because the Bible does. They are completely contained between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They are ruling the Middle East after the Old Testament ends, and they are out of power by the time the New Testament begins. But they still leave some major influences on our reading of the New Testament, and that's part of the reason we kind of want to give them a little bit more due. A lot for those first two in particular, you can just go read parts of the Bible to read about them. The Greeks, not nearly the same wealth of scriptures. The dates, just very briefly, because if you're if you're doing a history report and you're like, I know it's in this podcast somewhere, I'm going to listen and find these dates. Well, you'll probably do it faster just to Google it, which is the reason I don't focus on dates as much. But Alexander the Great came to power around 336 BC, and then he very quickly conquers the Persian Empire, astoundingly fast, historically speaking.
Which is depicted by what in the Bible?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second.
all right,
But
all
yeah,
right.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Robinson's so excited. He can't contain himself.
Mr. Smith knows me too well.
Oh,
He knows
that's all right.
I jump ahead. I'm like, hey, this is what this reminds me of, and I start saying it, and then I see it down 2 points later. It was already
Yeah.
Decently and in order, Mr. Robinson.
It
Decently
is.
and in
No,
order.
but that's all right. No, actually, I think that's a good point. We might
Yeah.
go there. Let me wrap up their
All right, good.
bookends, because Alexander the Great, sure, he takes over. He briefly rules over a unified Greek empire, but it quickly splinters after his death, and he dies young too. I mean, he only has
33.
that sounds right. I did not look up his age of death, but he when he dies after again about 10 to 15 years of ruling this empire, it splits into 4 different parts, and those 4 parts have various lifespans, but the last of them goes away at 30 BC with the death of the famous Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, which I think even made some news lately where there was a Cleopatra show or something. I never saw it. I'm not recommending it.
Yeah, it was a TV show where they had used a black woman to depict Cleopatra, and Greeks and I think even some Egyptians were kind of up in arms because they felt, well, no, that's not actually accurate.
Exactly.
She was not a native Egyptian.
Which is ironic because there's other time periods in history there were black pharaohs. I mean, there are times that you could go to various places in history and have someone not that Cleopatra, but somebody else, who was of different ethnicities and so on. But again, she is ruling Egypt and is the last of those 4 Greek kingdoms that eventually is swallowed up by the Romans. But let me actually pause real quick and just kind of jump back to what Mr. Robinson brought up. Do you want to cover Daniel 8? Mr. Robinson?
Definitely not.
Okay. All right, then I will. And so in Daniel 8, you have another kind of vision here with a ram and a goat. And I think I even kind of forgot to mention that with the Persians, there was one other animal listed here in Daniel 8 where you have this ram. And I think I might just be kind of summarizing to avoid getting too much into this prophecy. But Daniel's very specific that this ram that is defeated by a goat are representatives of the Persians and the Greeks, and that's going to be in verses 20 to 22 in Daniel chapter 8, where he says that the ram that you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of the Medes and the Persians, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And what's interesting about this goat is that it's pictured as having a large horn that gets broken off and 4 horns replace it. And so the Bible's even specific here. Daniel gets very specific prophecies. This is still Daniel 8:21, where it says the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. The first king of the Greeks who conquers the Persians is Alexander the Great. As for the broken horn and the 4 horns that stood up in his place, 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation, but not with its power. And that, again, some of our booklets and some other histories go into the various different Greek kingdoms. I'm not sure I want to try to break all those down in specific at this time, because perhaps the bigger point is that even though it was not a unified empire, it had these 4 horns. The leopard back in Daniel chapter 7 had 4 heads, and so even though it has that lack of a political unity, it still is an empire that had a unified culture. And it's a culture that's a word that even does show up in the New Testament in variations that is frequently termed Hellenism. I'm hoping that word is not too new here. I'm kind of looking, okay, Mr.
Yeah, let me summarize
Oh, yeah.
and make sure I highlight what Mr. Robinson was excited about, because I could read it in his eyes, that the idea that Alexander was so quick to accomplish all this, and what is the animal that's used to picture him, and that is a leopard, so, and sure enough, the swiftest of land animals in that sense, but also the 4-headed nature of it in terms of, right, he died. You're saying it was split into 4 different kind of sub-kingdoms, but at the same time, the culture, this is why this is really helpful, I think, because, among the many reasons, in the New Testament, clearly Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, has made an impact. By the time you're reading the New Testament, that is part of the tension in the area, even in the first century church, where the apostles, some guys come up to the apostles and say, hey, the Hellenistic Jews or, widows and such are being left out. There was very kind of a cultural mix that was a real challenge at that time. And what you're saying is that how did that culture come to be so implanted at the time? Well, because you had the vast spread of Greece and its culture being spread everywhere. And so the Greek culture has impacted so much of the areas around it. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and especially for our young adults, if you've ever studied anything about ancient history, this is where things like the Greek pantheon becomes very popular throughout the entire Middle East region. Again, like Mr. Smith mentioned, in the New Testament, you find one time where Paul and Barnabas, this is in Acts 14, by the way, where they are mistaken for Greek deities.
Zeus and Mercury, I think, or Zeus
right.
and was it Mercury? Is that the?
I believe it's Hermes, because I think it's
yeah.
The Greek, and that's a good point, because if it had been even the Roman culture, it would have been Mercury.
Right.
But since it's the Greek culture, it's still Hermes. And they had these Greek names for the deities that they were still looking for and that were being worshipped. Paul and Barnabas, when they travel around, they also, now this one I did not put in my notes, so we'll see if you guys can help me out here. Is it the temple to Artemis in Ephesus that is, great is Artemis?
Diana.
Okay.
Great is Diana, the Ephesians.
Right. Yeah. And so it's some of these other, gods of Greek influence that are being celebrated and worshipped throughout these various places that the apostles are interacting with.
Well, going from what I understand, going back to Alexander the Great and him conquering the Persians and getting all the way to India, which is, just go look at a map, it's pretty impressive. But that they were going also spreading Hellenism. They were spreading Greek culture. So what is all that? Well, it's language, it's their religion, and it's funny because Mr. O'Gwen points this out when you get to Romans. When Paul's writing to the Romans, he's writing to 3 groups. He's writing to the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. And he would point out that the Romans were kind of obsessed with the Greeks. And so the Greeks thought that they were probably the best. But then the Romans are like, yeah, but we conquered all of you, so we're really the best. And then the Jews are like, well, we have the commandments, so we're the best. And so you kind of see this hodgepodge and mixture. But that spread of Hellenism in between the testaments starts to explain some things we see on the scene when we get to the Gospels.
Yeah, it's interesting the obsession you're talking about, because that's the correlation you see. Diana, for instance, specifically is a Roman goddess, but you mentioned Artemis, and there just happens to be also this Greek goddess, Artemis, that is the parallel of that. And you see these kind of parallels. Mythology used to fascinate me when I was a kid. I was very much, even the Norse myths. I really dug all those. So anyway, yeah, the spread of culture in that way, which really, what is the New Testament written in? It's not written in Latin. It was written in Greek. It became kind of the lingua franca, right? It became kind of the language of the world.
Well, just think Mr. O'Gwyn has another, I know it's all about Mr. O'Gwyn today. He has another Bible study that talks about the 7 things that prepared the world for Christ's gospel to go out into the world, and Hellenism actually was an advantage. It brought a more common language. Well, the Romans actually probably brought more things in with the highways and the Pax Romana and different things like that.
They contributed as well, right?
But yeah, you could see how the table was being set for Christ to come in with his ministry, and then the spread to the rest of the world.
Right, and I think those are great examples of what we mean by Hellenism going out. That it was a unified language. It was the same gods and goddesses. It was a unified culture. Cities, frequently had similar setups and things that might not be as organized as the Romans would be later on, but again, had the same expectations of what things were. And what's kind of interesting is that for a lot of people in the ancient world, they were almost willing to accept it. If your ruling class speaks a different language, well, it might behoove us to go ahead and learn that language so that we can not be left behind here. And, they almost like we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, a lot of pagan societies would just rebrand their gods and goddesses. They would say, okay, well, you have, you want to call it this goddess Diana. Well, it sounds like Artemis, so we're just going to, slap a new name on an old goddess or whatever. And so they frequently did that, but it was again the Greeks that kind of left their main stamp on this area about their gods and goddesses being there. But this does produce one of the major things that happens in between the Old Testament and New Testament. Perhaps the most famous person between the Old Testament and New Testament is who we've already mentioned here, is Alexander the Great. But one of the most famous events for the Bible is the Maccabean revolt, where the Jews actually revolt against the Hellenism. They are not wanting to become Greeks. They are not looking to become that, at least some were.
I was going to say some were compromising, and the Maccabean revolt was to get it back under control.
Yes, yeah, that's a great way to put it. And again, this happens around 167 to 160 BC. So you're well into the point where Alexander's been off the scene for 150 whatever years, and so you have the Jewish state. I believe it's the Seleucid, the one that's based out of Syria, is the one kind of enforcing things. A king named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is going in and sparks the rebellion by setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple of God. And so what we find in the New Testament described as the abomination of desolation had this forerunner, if you will, because we're kind of famous in the New Testament that's a prophecy. We were prophetic, looking for an abomination of desolation. But for the Jews in Christ's audience and his disciples specifically there in Matthew 24, that was a very real thing that for them had happened not too long ago. That had happened, about 150 years beforehand. And so they were like, "Oh, you're telling us this is about to happen a second time? That this abomination is going to be back on the scene because of what they had seen here." Because of that, because of the Jewish resistance, they actually do very briefly, I forget exactly how many years, have a small independent country that's not going to last very long, because we'll get to this iron beast in a second. But one thing that Mr. Robinson, you had mentioned you have studied is, again, these sects in Judaism of the Pharisees and Sadducees, who you don't find in the New Testament, but you do find. Yep. Or you don't find in the Old Testament.
This is where they arise from. This will be pretty high level, although there is quite a bit of detail about this. If you wonder, these summaries that you're about to hear, again, Mr. O'Gwyn goes into great detail about there's a lot more about this we know than you might think that we know, in the history of how things got down to where we were. But once the Old Testament ended, and the Jewish nation continued, but almost never really ruling over themselves or for not very long periods of time. And then something like Hellenism comes through. There was a lot of compromise, and without God overseeing things in the way He was previous to the end of the Old Testament, you start having a lot of politics entering into the Levites and the priesthood and who's in charge and all those different kind of things. And so you have this, like, it begins to emerge with this really messy kind of hierarchy in Matthew in the first Gospels. But what you see is this Maccabean revolt where, to their credit, there were, you got to think about who's left in that area of Israel and Jerusalem at the time is mostly Jews, not exclusively, but primarily Jews. But you also had a number of the Levites. So here Alexander the Great comes through with Hellenism, and the Maccabeans revolt against it, but that didn't really end things entirely. And so you have the Sadducees, and they're more or less descendants of the Levites. And so when you come on the scene in Matthew, they still have control of the temple. So even though they weren't doing a great job of teaching the people to live God's way, they were these wealthy aristocrats that had been influenced by Hellenism, and they controlled the temple, which is critical to why the Pharisees are who they were. So the Pharisees, again, to their credit, were the lay people who recognized the reason we're in this trouble is because of the many times we've broken the covenant with God. So what can we do so that we don't end up in a situation where we're breaking God's law, breaking the Sabbath? They're strict covenant supporters. So how do we avoid breaking God's law so he can, not only so we don't get in trouble again, but so we can be a righteous nation? I'll read to you from the Jewish New Testament commentary, which is what do we call it? He's a Messianic Jew who wrote a commentary on the New Testament, and he has some really interesting insights on it. So he says these Pharisees not only took the Torah to be God's word to man. What's our definition of Torah? Is it the whole?
No, if it's Tanakh, it's the Old Testament.
That's the Tanakh.
It's the whole Testament.
So they took not only the whole Old Testament to be God's word to man, but also considered the accumulated traditions handed down over the centuries by the sages and teachers to be God's words as well, the oral Torah. So that a system for living developed which touched every aspect of life. So all these little rituals and traditions that we read about from time to time there in the New Testament, this is where they began to emerge from. And you can also see now how when Christ condemns the Pharisees for bringing their traditions on the same level as the law, where this problem began by elevating the oral tradition of the law. Not everybody did it, but the Pharisees did, to be equal with God's law. So here's one example of it. Here's how we're going to protect people from breaking the Sabbath. We're going to put a hedge around the law so that you can't even wander up close enough to breaking the Sabbath. So they had all these regulations. So again, let's see, this is back to, we'll read. Okay, let me read this. Matthew 12, verses 1 and 2. It says in Matthew 12, verses 1 and 2, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath.'" So really, if you think about it, you might question, so what are these Pharisees basing this breaking of the Sabbath on? Mr. O'Gwen says, the rabbis had asked the question, talking about Matthew 12, 1 and 2 here very specifically. The rabbis had asked the question, what is work? Because again, we're putting a hedge about the law, so we're making sure we're very careful about not breaking it. He says, you and I ought to know what work is, but they wanted to get technical about what work is. So they finally defined 39 different categories of work that were prohibited on the Sabbath, and each of those 39 types was subdivided into other groups. So this came under the prohibition of harvesting on the Sabbath. Anything over 3 heads of grains consisted of harvesting. They had to define harvesting. You shouldn't harvest. Well, all right, how much is harvesting? They had it all figured out. One other example, I won't, there's not much more of this. Matthew 12 and verse 7, "But if you had known what it means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless." And then it gets into the washings. in Mark 7, verses 1 through 5, and it says, Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. When they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they had found fault. And we won't go all through it. So, as many of you probably know, this whole story here isn't about hygiene. So here's what the Jewish New Testament commentary says about this section here. Mark's explanation of ritual hand washing in the verse corresponds to the details set forth in the Mishnah, the tradition of the elders, that was eventually written down. There are 4 chapters dedicated to what defiles and the proper way to clean hands. In the marketplace, one may touch ceremonially impure things. The impurity is removed by rinsing up to the wrist. Orthodox Jews today observe the ritual hand washing before meals. The rationale for it has nothing to do with hygiene, but is based on the idea that a man's home is his temple. Let me come back to that. With the dining table his altar, the food his sacrifice, and himself the priest. Since the Bible requires priests to be ceremonially pure before offering sacrifices on the temple altar, their traditions require the same before eating a meal. So this violation, according to the Pharisees, is what they were accusing Jesus Christ's disciples of not doing. They're not doing this ceremonial hand washing. But the other thing that's interesting about it, this is where that ties back in with the Sadducees. The Sadducees, at least, as mostly Levite descendants, did have a right to be in control of the Temple Mount. And this really always drove the Pharisees crazy that they didn't control that. So then they just said, well, each of our own houses is like its own mini temple. And so then I'm the priest, and as the Jewish New Testament commentary guy mentioned there. But you start to see there's actually way more we could go on about, but I think that kind of gets the idea. And it's these Pharisees. I give them some credit for trying to do something noble, a recognition that they had violated their covenant with God. Hey, let's not do that again. So how are we going to make sure this never happens? Well, we're going to put these hedges about the law, which Jesus Christ later described as a burdensome thing. They had made the Sabbath and things a burden to the lay people, although he still told them to do what they say. And follow their restrictions.
Sit in Moses' seat,
Yeah.
he said. Yeah, and that's actually kind of an acknowledgement that the Pharisees may not be the Sadducees, and they are and he definitely respected, Jesus did, the role of the priest. Like when he came to the lepers, he sent them to the high priest. Mm-hmm. They were the priests. I've had someone try to tell me, the Jews in charge that day, they weren't really Jews, and Jesus knew it. Well, then he disobeyed the law by sending the lepers to the high priest because that they were. But before I get into what I noticed and what you said, Mr. DeSimone has texted me. He was wondering if I could come down just real quick. It'd be kind of fun, but we're here in the middle of a podcast. But we just passed 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. So to our YouTube channel, 500,000 subscribers. Now, of course, we're recording this more than a week earlier, about a week before some of you are going to hear it, a week or two. Actually, yeah, about 2 weeks before some of you are going to hear this. But anyway, it was kind of nice to see. And that he even took a little picture of the screen. It was 5 million.
Nice.
500,005. So hey, 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. That's exciting. But tying in with the whole theme in terms of this changing culture, Mr. Robinson was highlighting there. The Bible even says there's a lot of tension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that they did not like each other. If anything, that shows you how much they hated Jesus, was that they were willing to work together. They were willing to work together with the Herodians, who they also did not like. And it's my understanding the Sadducees were a little more willing to work with the Romans a bit, and the Pharisees. I could imagine that here you have this spread of Hellenistic culture everywhere. You have this pagan, they would see it, culture influencing the entire world around them because of how vast the Hellenistic culture had become and how integrated. And here they are trying to protect what they see as, God's way of doing things. And so putting up all these kind of hedges to fight off the influence. And here they look at the Sadducees, and they're compromising too. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had heard that there would be a frustration for the Pharisees that they didn't control the temple. Yeah. And so what do? You take the things of the temple and turn it into your own personal little, your home is kind of like your temple. And so you see this weird environment of competition going on here at the beginning of the New Testament, and seeing the influence generated by these changing of kingdoms during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You kind of see how those pieces came to be on the board.
Yeah. And the key mistake that the Pharisees made, they made a couple, but the key one was elevating the oral tradition of the law to be equivalent, more or less, with Scripture. And so they would consider both. And so that and God's, like the Corban example, where the Pharisees said, "Oh, I can't take care of my old parents because I've dedicated my money to the temple." Christ used that as their own tradition, violating God, one of the commandments about honoring your parents. Now, as we've gotten into actually talking about the Pharisees at the time of Christ, at this point the Greeks are gone, right? And the Romans have come through town.
Right. And yeah, to kind of sum up conclude with the Greeks, the main thing here is that even though they are not politically in charge at this point, like we've been trying to highlight, their language was the language the Bible was written in. It was a language a lot of people were speaking. We brought up Acts chapter 6, that part of the reason they had to appoint deacons was that they, if God didn't grant them the ability to speak in tongues, there was problems in the church because they just didn't know what to do for each other when half of the church was Greek speaking and the other half was speaking either Hebrew or Aramaic or something. And then we mentioned the Greek deities that are throughout, the abomination of desolation, and several other examples that again actually go back more to the Greek culture than it does to the Romans. But yeah, then the Greeks are kicked out by the Maccabees and are also a little distracted because they're starting to get swallowed up by that iron beast from Daniel. Because, the last one for us to talk about today is the Romans. And again, we might not spend as much time on the Romans because this is where you end up. This is where you get to in the New Testament. And so dating the Romans is a little tricky because you could start with the founding of the city, or, I know in my notes I put down 27 BC as being the date that they transitioned formally to an empire to the degree that it was formal, I suppose. And then usually the date that is given to the end of the Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor is deposed. At that point, the Roman emperors were not even worthy of being killed by their conquerors. They just had someone kick them off the throne. And needless to say, 476 AD is far after the Old Testament is done. I'm sorry, that's true too, but the New Testament is what I was trying to say.
Well, it'd be over 800 years, right?
Yeah, and certainly from the Old Testament, 800 plus years, and from the New Testament, 400 plus years. And so you have the Romans at that point. Now, the interesting thing in 476 is that even though history would say that that's the end of the Roman Empire, we certainly know from prophecy and in our booklets, there are revivals of the Roman system throughout the centuries after 476. And that is a topic for a different day. But again, just as a quick reminder, if you thought, well, don't we say the Romans continued? Yes, they did. It's just again, even the Book of Revelation describes that as a deadly wound. That it looked like the entire system was done, and yet has persisted to this very day. The Romans are able to not only pick off the Greeks, but they have conquered the entire Mediterranean area. They've gotten up into Britain. Actually, by the time the New Testament starts, they haven't quite conquered Britain yet, but they will get there. They conquer into Egypt, every part of North Africa, and again, one of the largest empires that the world had seen. And in the process of that, one of their generals named Pompey the Great, who would later fall at the hands of Julius Caesar. But at this time, he is off expanding the Roman banner to the east of Rome, and he's going to be the one who conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC.
Oh, really? It's Pompey.
Yes, and I don't recall all the specifics of that, but I believe what Mr. Robinson was bringing up about the divisions within the Jewish culture were already present and were exploited by Pompey. That when he showed up, one of the Jewish sects was like, well, we can't beat this other Jewish sect on our own. We'll use the Romans to help. Nothing will go wrong there. And sure enough, the Romans come in to help one group, and then they just stick around because, well, we helped, but we better stay here to make sure that peace and order are put into place and all sorts of stuff.
Yes.
And that is sure enough who is in charge by the time you get to the birth of Jesus Christ and the beginning of the New Testament. And so the Romans are going to be the ones who are patrolling the streets. They're going to be the ones who crucified Jesus. They're the ones who Paul is interacting with. When you read about guys like Herod and Pontius Pilate, they're Roman officials. They have taken over the civil leadership at that time. And there's certainly a lot of Roman laws and customs that have taken over and even get referenced a bit in the New Testament as well. I think one of the ones that Mr. Smith, I know I've heard you talk about, is kind of found there in Matthew 5 about the law of compulsion, about going a mile. I'm trying to remember do you remember the specifics of what you preached about on that at one time?
Yeah, it's my understanding when Christ says, if someone compels you to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2. That was a right of the Roman army to be able to compel individuals to walk with them a certain time to help carry, your sack of your goods, etc. That Christ was saying, yeah, go the extra mile. Actually, go more than was. So that is my understanding. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean that's my understanding as well, and that it certainly was one that Christ was almost pointing out. If you do that, you're saving somebody else from having the soldier grab them. By you going 2 miles, that somebody else.
That's someone else that didn't have to get grabbed. And it's easy to think of these things as just, it's a great lesson. But when Christ was talking to people, they would have had that done to them. They knew exactly what he was talking about. He was literally talking to them about things they experienced under the very active and real Roman Empire.
And the Romans operated, and what's kind of interesting is sometimes I think we look at kingdoms or empires and we think, well, they have one guy in charge. But a lot of times their governors might not be called governors like we have in the United States or various places today. They might be called kings in their own right. And so sometimes you even get examples in the New Testament where Luke 19 is an example where the parable is about someone going away to receive their kingdom. Well, that was a very Roman practice where if they needed someone to be in charge of one of their provinces, they might technically be the king of that province, but they would have to travel to Rome, get told they were okay by the emperor, and then be able to come back to rule their kingdom. And so people who were going to be in charge may have to make a homage to Rome, if you will, to get blessed by that. And so when Christ is sort of bringing up some of those things that again, there's a Roman practice to it that people would have been familiar with.
Interesting.
And that would help out there, or again, help them to maybe be like, oh, right, just like Herod did before he took over, just like so-and-so did before they took over. We certainly, again, just to kind of wrap up some of the stuff in Daniel, I mean, it's by now you're into the legs of iron, and in Daniel 7, it's just, to summarize it, called a terrible iron beast. And then there's horns and everything else that I won't quite get into today. But again, a lot of Roman laws and customs, I guess oppression might be the best word for it. I know that Mr. Robinson and I, we've both seen a clip from an old movie that we might even leave nameless, because they made the joke in the movie of, well, what have the Romans ever done for us? Because the Jews were constantly revolting against the Romans, and that actually doesn't form part of the New Testament too.
Well, even amongst the disciples, there was the zealot.
Yes.
There were the people left a lot of things behind to come follow Christ, and one of them was taking up arms against the Romans.
Right, and in fact, even as the New Testament is, or in the middle of the New Testament, after the Book of Acts, but John lived past it, was when the Romans finally laid siege to Jerusalem formally and started and destroyed the temple and did other things to it. And so the Romans had quite a role to play there, even though, again, our silly clip that Mr. Robinson and I know about was that the Romans did do quite a bit for their empire to maintain its unity, built a lot of roads. And
that's actually, I was kind of going through here reviewing the ways in which what happened between the Testaments really did pave the way for Christ's message and the gospel account to go out into the world. And one of them was what we refer to as Pax Romana. But, say what you want about the Romans, man, they kept the peace. And that was no easy thing. And they built amazing highways. And the Greek language being extant throughout that area, it would be like if God, well, in fact, I think that there is a parallel to this personally, but how did God pave the way here at the end time for Mr. Armstrong's ministry to go out? Well, guess what? The dominance of the English speaking nation. So we once again had a dominant. I think the French was the lingua franca for a while, but English became the dominant language. And so guess what? If you were writing books of the Bible again, you would write them in English because that's
right.
the
You would
most common
maximize
language.
the number of people in the world that would be able to have access to them.
One other thing I hadn't thought about, and I know we're just getting off a little bit, but I had forgotten about, is that at that time period when Christ came, a lot of people were expecting the Messiah because of Daniel's prophecy, which is good to remember.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great point too, that they were looking and they were also wanting him to restore the kingdom at that time and sort of fulfill those again prophecies in the Old Testament, the ones we look at a lot for the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. They wanted them during their day, and you could understand why if you have this foreign power that's come and okay, this is the beast of iron, time for that stone to come out. You know, they again, it wasn't all written at the same time. They'd had those scriptures for centuries by that point, and they were like, okay, wow, look at how this has all gone. We've seen the different kingdoms cycle through. We're clearly in the iron right now. And they can probably be forgiven for not recognizing, there's going to be 2,000 more years before this iron is all the way to the end.
Yeah, I think Josephus records it. I hate to say that with certainty. I'm not the expert, but I thought I recall reading that he wrote that even when Alexander the Great was kind of conquering through that the priests there in Jerusalem actually showed him the prophecies to say, so they were not ignorant, right? They say, hey, wait, this is Rome. Look, we ought to be getting close to a Messiah, and the idea that they were living through those things, and that even those who had been aware of the prophecies would be seeing the transitions and been looking forward to what God was going to bring, is kind of an interesting perspective.
Yep. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, even in Acts 1, I mean, the disciples are still asking Christ, is
this it?
Yeah, are you going to restore the kingdom at this time? And to Mr. Robinson's point, I mean, it made me think of, I hope I'm in the right chapter. I was trying to flip around and find it real fast. And so Acts 18, unless I'm wrong. But there is a story where Paul goes into Corinth, and the Jews are so mad at him, they drag him before a Roman official. But I mean, like you said, this is Pax Romana. Yeah. The Romans are like, what, you're arguing about your law? Who cares? Get out of here.
Yeah, right. Arguably, Paul got more justice from the Romans than he ever did from the Jews.
And so it's an amazing setup that God did to have this, 200 years of relative, and relative might be doing some heavy lifting there, but some relative peace compared to what came before it and what came after it, because there certainly was some violence, and I'm sure the Jews in 70 AD did not find it to be very poxy, if you will. Am I allowed to do that to a Latin word? I'm not sure.
Paxy. It was very paxy.
Who knows what I ended up saying in Latin?
We'll allow it.
Okay.
We'll allow it.
But anyway, certainly some groups of people did not find it to be incredibly peaceful during that time of peace. But for the Christians who were just trying to traverse hundreds of miles, knowing that you actually have a military might system that is going to go out and hunt down pirates, secure the borders, do different things that means that Paul would travel from point A to point B with not really too many
safety.
concerns. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean they were in love with the powers. It's also the very power that took their lives, the very same power. But they still recognize, hey, it's not God's kingdom right now, but you know what? It is allowing for the gospel to go forth. God has made conditions. They're not ideal for his people, but you know what? They're great for his work. And sometimes we have to have that perspective.
Yeah. Well, and even with all that, I mean, it's interesting that this is the part of the Bible that God even inspired those statements about, honoring the king, or Romans 13 about things. He didn't inspire those when King David was in charge or Joshua was leading things. It was Roman officials that they were being told to obey.
What a good point, because there's this really independent mindset in some Americans, and sometimes we think something is unjust, then we don't have to follow it, and that's not what we're taught in the Bible.
That's right. Right. Well, wow.
We've gotten ourselves to the New Testament. So
we've made it to the New Testament. That's good news, because I like the New Testament. It's nice to we can keep it in the Bible. Thank you, Mr. Sandor. Like I said, I I don't study a lot of history directly. I do with related to my Bible studies and such, but I always enjoy hearing people talk about it who are very informed by it. And I know Mr. Robinson is a real fan of that. And yeah, I remember thinking, because we have recorded, now it's like 2 days, we've had, well, I say 3 guests, 2 guests, one of them twice, that's you. And I thought it would just be a shame not to have Mr. Sandor on and not talk about something historical. So we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully that anybody else out there that wondered what went on between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament and where these people come from got an answer that is satisfactory towards them. I think it's fun to talk about, and it really does add more context than you might think for the world that appears when Christ comes on the scene, and how we got there and how it shaped how the other thing in there was the Jewish diaspora, so that the Jews had scattered everywhere and they had large congregations in Rome and in Alexandria, for example. And so then when the gospel message started going out, there were natural places to start going and preaching to the Jews that had been dispersed, but also set up synagogues or a place to have a church congregation.
Right. So thank you very much, Mr. Sandor. We hope you have a wonderful time here in Charlotte. And then eventually, when it's sad for us that your time here comes to an end, a safe trip back.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Smith and Robinson.